Nick Rowley was the Senior Advisor on Sustainability and Climate Change to then British Prime Minister Tony Blair, and in 2009 he was the Strategic Director of the Copenhagen Climate Council. He joins us in the studio this evening. Nick, welcome. Let's think, thinking back 5 years ago, almost exactly, to Copenhagen. Great expectations heading into that. Not a lot seemed to come out of it. Heading into this new round, which is another sort of 12-month process. What are the expectations?
Well, I suppose anybody looking at another major conference, looking at the global climate problem with heads of state and a fair bit of fanfare, it's tempting to say, oh, same old, another big meeting, not much will come out of it. I think that's wrong. I think there's been a lot of learning that's gone on over the last 5 years, both by Ban Ki-moon and also others working to actually achieve progress in relation to international policy on climate change. And I think that is reflected by the agenda that we've got over the 23rd, which is today in New York.
Talk us through some of that agenda then, Nick, and the learning that's gone on in that last 5 years or so, why you think it's going to be so different this time round.
Well, I think people tended to look at Copenhagen as this point in time, and it was a fantastic point in time because you'd had a lot of heightened awareness of the climate problem, a lot of engagement from political leaders around the world and business leaders as well to a degree, and an understanding that there needed to be a more adequate global climate treaty. It was a global climate treaty which was seen as being the key thing that would actually give a cascade of investment and policy down at state level. I think that that sort of top-down approach really is no longer seen as being the way that one can really achieve progress. So if you look at what the UN is doing, Ban Ki-moon has been on this major climate march. Now that's strange, the ultimate insider actually being on the street with the outsiders, actually trying to raise public awareness within civil society. He's also got some of the senior CEOs of Fortune 500 companies there looking to nut out with senior political leaders what are the sort of policies that will help you decarbonise your processes, will help you invest in alternatives to fossil fuels, and really working together rather than waiting for negotiators and heads of state to come out with some grand treaty. It's a far more, I think, sophisticated and potentially more effective approach.
So, in essence, Nick, is this an attempt to depoliticise the debate and to look at it in either social terms or even economic terms?
Well, at one level you could say that. I mean, it will always be a political issue, but it's certainly depoliticising it in terms of it being a right or a left issue. Indeed, if you look at some of the most progressive state or national governments around the world, ironically perhaps to some, looking at the context here in Australia, they actually come from the right of politics. But I think that the word I would use is that the way the UN is looking at convening this meeting is to take a very practical approach to what can be done to actually reduce the risks of climate change. And no matter what it is that major political leaders agree to, or indeed what international treaties are agreed, ultimately it's going to be the large pulp and paper companies, the large energy companies, the large transport companies that are going to have to change what they do. Really, that international policy gives them licence to do that, and that the UN is engaging with them to help inform the policy, I think is a really good thing.
Nick, when we look at summits like this, Copenhagen, what's going on in the UN now over the next few days, we often see what's like the tip of the iceberg. We get the rhetoric, we see all the great shots. Talk us through what might be going on behind the scenes over these next few days between these 120 countries. Obviously, the leaders of India and China not there, but some representatives there. Will there be kind of discussions and wrangling behind the scenes?
Well, this all really is about building momentum through to Paris 2015. That is the next major UN meeting that will focus on the global climate problem. I'm pretty confident that that is going to be a far more successful meeting than Copenhagen, because I think the political dynamics are really pretty positive. You've already got agreement between China and the US, the two major emitters in the global economy, to reduce emissions through time. What you need to do is to embed those sort of agreements in an international treaty. But we shouldn't look at this meeting as something which is either going to be a rip-roaring success or an utter failure. We shouldn't look at it in binary terms. It's essentially a step forward. And the way in which this agenda has been put together by the UN, I think, is pretty clever. It's actually looked at those elements of what goes on in the global economy and focused on them. So, if you look over the last 10 years, over 100 million hectares of rainforest is no longer around. That's a pretty sad thing for a whole lot of charismatic megafauna that live there, but it's also very, very bad for the global climate problem. When you take the trees off, you've got the soil below, that soil oxidises, that adds to the global climate problem. That has to stop. And engaging with some of the businesses that are helping do that is a really sensible thing. And looking at the incentives that will mean saving forests is not just a really good thing to do, which makes the orangutans happy. It's a really good thing to do because those elements, those private industries and others that have got some control over land, look at maintain the forest cover as a means of actually making profit and getting investment. So it's those sort of changes on the deforestation side that I think will be focused on in the agenda in New York today.
There was a lot of talk at the time of Copenhagen leading up to it of a line in the sand. 2% global warming on average by end of century is something that will mitigate the sort of catastrophic implications. It seems though we're still on trend for something more like 4% or 5% unless we can do something.
Yeah.
Is that line in the sand getting washed away before our eyes? Is it going to have to be redrawn?
Well, it's always very easy to agree on targets at some point in the future. And there is an agreement coming out of Copenhagen, actually, that there will be a limit of 2 degrees that will actually maintain the global warming effect.
We haven't done much about it, though. We've just said that's a good limit. But
well, that's right. It's really easy to agree on those things. If you actually look at the early climate change predictions by the UNFCCC and others going back to the late 80s and early 90s, and you can actually now track, looking at the warming, observed warming, not predictions, not what might happen in the future, but observed warming back from those early pieces of global analysis. You're right, John, I'm sorry to say, but you're right. We're actually tracking up towards, at the moment, to around about 4 or 4+ degrees of warming. That sounds pretty nice when you're in the middle of a Melbourne or a Sydney winter, or you're shivering because of your insulation and there's wind coming under your door. Gee, a bit warm wouldn't be too bad. If only it was so. That level of warming leads to a fiercely unstable climate, where you're going to have severe weather events. You look at what's happening to the Antarctic ice sheets, sea level rise, where do most people live? They live near the sea in major conurbations. This is going to equal great cost, great risk, and impacts that aren't just about environmental impacts. They're societal impacts, they're economic impacts, and they're things that I think are best avoided.
Nick, those impacts have been known by many people for many years. When there's so many issues on the global agenda at any one time, this particular moment in time seems particularly bad. We've got excessive numbers of refugees trying to find homes, civil unrest, Ebola, Iraq, Syria. How do politicians convince everyday people to focus on an issue that is 20, 30, 40, 50 years into the future, when in a sense, as social beings, we engage in what is immediate and present to our sense of survival and security?
Hey, look, I really understand what you're saying. It's very, very difficult. But I don't think that this, unfortunately, is just a future issue. You look at what's happened in cities like Bangkok or Jakarta. They've been underwater over the last 2 years for quite significant periods. You look at things like Hurricane Sandy and the insurance cost in a city like New York. These things have happened. They're not predicted. They've actually happened. So the costs are real.
In which case, why isn't there more action more quickly if it's happening right now? Why does it take so long to get concrete action on these?
Well, because we can all agree that we need action on climate change. Yeah, but it's not about just flicking the switch or doing a bit more in terms of energy efficiency. It's actually related to political economy. Where is the current power? Where does the power come from? The power largely comes from, when it comes to electricity, from combusting fossil fuels. That has to change. We can do that. We've got existing technologies that will do it. But the existing interests are very powerful and they're politically powerful. Equally, there may be some measure of cost. There was recently a report just a few minutes ago by Jake looking at what was happening here in Australia in relation to the Energy Green Paper. That was a terrific green paper for around about 100 years ago. Totally blind in relation to the need to decarbonise our energy supply side here in Australia. That is not an easy thing to do. You can't just do it. It actually will take time. You need to put in policies that are credible, that are also indicate a level of stability and continuity, not the to-y, fro-y, up and downy toxic politics that we've had here in Australia. It's enormously hard. But the other thing I think you're pointing to, Kumi, is just concentration. If you're a global leader and you've got a problem like ISIS, or you've got a problem like the Ukraine, or whatever else it is, events tend to get in the way of what you might do as a political leader in the long term. But effective political leaders need to be able to chew gum and ride horses at the same time.
Forgive me for asking a question on an area of personal interest, Nick, American politics. How is this going to feed into next year? Barack Obama will be in the final 18 months of his presidency. Tried and failed to get cap and trade through Congress in 2010.
He did.
He's been trying to regulate through the EPA to shut down coal plants and do all sorts of things to try and reduce emissions that way. Is this potentially a big legacy item that he could get achieved?
I think so. I think if you look at his State of the Union address, and I think if you look at the policies that have flowed on from that, and the way in which he has framed this issue, not about just saving the world, but it's about health, and it's about the robustness of the US economy. I looked at the Rockefeller Brothers Fund. They've just announced $53 billion of investment that will be going towards renewables. The Rockefellers put a lot of money into fossil fuels. I've been lucky enough to go to their rather nice house. It's not a 2 up, 2 down. It's rather a large place on the Hudson River north of New York at Pocantico. There's fossil fuels dripping off the walls with the Picasso paintings and the high quality timbers and everything else. That was born of fossil fuels. But that is a company, that is an entity, that is a fund that is saying that is not the future. Where we are going to put our money is in the alternatives, in the low carbon alternatives, because that's where the growth really will be.
Good for the future, but they're not giving any of the other money they've already got back.
Well,
Nick Rowley, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Good to talk to you.
Thanks.